Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this month's Eurosif EU Sustainable Finance Update, where we'll be providing you over a space of 30 to 40 minutes an update on all the relevant developments we've seen in the area of sustainable finance in the last couple of weeks. And I'm particularly delighted today to be joined for this event by Hugo Gallagher, Senior Policy Officer at Eurosif, and Federica Casassa, Policy Officer at Eurosif, who recently joined the team. Together, we'll walk you through the most recent developments. Just some few housekeeping things. The presentation and the recording will be available on our website after the event, in case you want to see it again and hear again what we had to say on specific agenda points. And you can ask through the Q&A tool in Zoom questions. And at the end of the presentation, if there's time left, we will try to address those. But in general, don't hesitate to also reach out to us if you have questions on the ongoing developments around the area of sustainable finance. As you will see, there are quite a few of them. So today, we're first of all share with you our highlights and thoughts on the sustainable finance strategy that was published by the European Commission on 6th of July. We will then dwell on the recently published reports by the European Sustainable Finance Platform, focusing on extensions of the taxonomy. We'll dwell a little bit on the taxonomy reporting rules, so-called Article 8 Taxonomy Delegated Act, which was published alongside the strategy. We'll look at the EU Green Bond Standard, which also accompanied the strategy, and will provide you with a high-level overview of the recent package of energy and climate measures in the so-called FIT45 legislative package, which was unveiled on the 14th of July by the European Commission. So jumping right in on the strategy, I think it's fair to say this was long expected, had changed in timeline several times, and I think everyone who has holds sustainable finance agenda in high esteem is very happy to have seen the publication of the strategy on the 6th of July, which sets out the EU institutions' roadmap for the remainder of this political cycle of the EU. That means the roadmap outlines the different milestones between now and 2024 on concrete policy actions the Commission will take to promote further sustainable finance. And I think if we take a look at a very high level, there's a few things that are striking about the strategy. I think first of all, it's fair to say that it is building on the 2018 action plan, that it is consolidating some of the actions around the EU taxonomy, around the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and other legislative and non-legislative initiatives that were already there in 2018. But it doesn't do only that, and it dwells further into some other areas which are relatively new, both in financial markets, looking at standards for financial products, raising the prospect of further intervention in the market for ESG ratings, or looking at voluntary climate pledges by financial institutions, to name but a few. And I think the strategy was clearly elaborated around a number of core themes. How do we now make sure, after a couple of years of focusing on green, that we now address sufficiently the question of the transition of the real economy? How do we create a more inclusive sustainable finance network framework that means that we take on board also retail investors, small and medium-sized enterprises, that we keep everyone on board and connected to the agenda? How do we look at the risk side of the equation, ensure financial stability and resilience of the sector? And how do we make sure that what the EU's done as a definite global leader in this area, how do we make sure that this remains aligned with now the other international efforts and regional efforts that are rapidly gaining pace, often drawing quite a bit of inspiration on what the EU's done since 2018 in its action plan? I think one of the most asked questions we get all the time is, well, how ambitious is this strategy? How ambitious is it? What is it trying to achieve? And I think it is fair to say that this is a difficult question to answer at this stage, because as we can see from the policy actions, many policy actions are subject to consultations, evaluations, and to possibly, policy choices that will be made further down the line in the next 3 years. So in terms of how ambitious the strategy is, we will only be able to answer that question in 2024, where we've seen which of the policy actions encapsulated in it have materialized or have been accelerated. But maybe I'd like to take the opportunity to actually now to turn to Hugo. So you've looked very with great attention to this strategy. What are for you the key highlights and points that you think we should that would be useful for our audience to pick out?
Yeah, thanks, Victor. So I suppose as has been maybe reflected already in Victor's comments, the strategy at this juncture is quite broad. It encompasses a lot of different elements, but just maybe to provide some highlights that reflect the interests of Eurosif or Eurosif's perspective, and perhaps also some of our input into the strategy while it was still being drafted by the Commission. There's just a few points that stood out to me, or that strike me as being particularly interesting. Perhaps first I would mention, consistent now with this seeming new emphasis on financing the transition, the Commission envisages adopting a complementary EU taxonomy climate delegated act that would specify or clarify from a sustainability standpoint the status of gas and nuclear energy. Of course, I think that's worth mentioning, just given the amount of controversy that was associated with the adoption of the first climate delegated act under the EU taxonomy earlier this year. So that is something that is mentioned sort of quite soon as you're reading the strategy. Of course, they also mentioned that the second delegated act that'll provide technical screening criteria for the remaining 4 environmental objectives can also be anticipated quite soon. Something we'll address a little bit later, when we're discussing the reports on extending the taxonomy by the Platform on Sustainable Finance, is a point in the strategy where the Commission has raised the prospect of extending the taxonomy to define and recognize intermediate performance levels, and also to identify activities that cause significant harm to environmental objectives. I think that's sort of worth just mentioning first off. A lot of movement is envisaged in relation to the taxonomy. Otherwise, some very interesting aspects of the strategy include references to product standards and labels, and this includes minimum sustainability criteria for SFDR Article 8 products in particular. Of course, Article 8 products receive mention in the strategy, whereas Article 9 products don't receive any mention at all, which is sort of a curious thing. There's also a reference to transition bonds and transition labels, which is quite interesting. Of course, one of the features of the strategy is that in places it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail as to what these standards or what various actions might actually entail. But it would be curious to see whether, this is speculation on my part, but whether transition bonds might in some way be linked to a taxonomy with intermediate performance levels. That is just something that springs to mind. But of course, there's nothing concrete in the strategy to suggest that. Otherwise, the Commission highlights the need to maybe examine ESG data and ratings providers, just to ensure that there are sound methodologies being applied, that there is transparency, and that conflicts of interest are minimized to the greatest extent. Similarly, the strategy envisages strengthening investors' capacity to engage with investee companies on sustainability issues, say through revising the Shareholder Rights Directive, or SRD2. And, you know, also there's a point on introducing requirements or obligations when financial institutions make voluntary pledges or net zero commitments, that perhaps such pledges should actually also imply some, you know, reporting requirements. Finally, what I've mentioned on the strategy is fiduciary duty, and particularly that of pension funds, and how it may be broadened to encompass consideration of sustainability impact. But I'll leave it here for the present and just hand back to Victor for a moment.
Thanks, Hugo, for flagging those very interesting, and you know, there's obviously many more items in the strategy, which contains a long list of actions. But you know, you've touched briefly already on the you know, some of the actions in the strategy which focus on the taxonomy, the EU taxonomy, and potentially, you know, thinking about extending it further, covering other areas. And so, you know, not long after the publication of the strategy, we saw the platform on sustainable finance, this expert group by the Commission, released 2 reports, one of which, for example, decided to cover off, you know, looking at social elements. So I know you've looked particularly closely at the social taxonomy report by the platform. So maybe, you know, can you share with us your kind of first thoughts, or how this is going to work?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Victor. So indeed, you know, the strategy was effectively published on the 6th of July, and then the following week, hot on its heels, was a report published by the Platform on Sustainable Finance as to the potential design of a social taxonomy. And I suppose what I just want to maybe emphasize very much at this point is that this report on the potential design of a social taxonomy is coming from the Platform on Sustainable Finance. It doesn't necessarily reflect the Commission's intentions or any, you know, thought that they might have about a social taxonomy at this point. It's also worth mentioning that, you know, it's still at quite an early stage. So this is an interim report and only just reflects the platform's work thus far on the topic. So it can't necessarily be taken as a final product. But I'll just, you know, provide a very brief maybe outline of the platform report on the social taxonomy, and in particular, given maybe the very complex nature of a lot of social issues and the fact that the social taxonomy would probably have to, you know, I mean, compete is maybe the wrong word, but would have to be part of a wider context in which you have social policy at member state level, and then national law governing a lot of company practices already. You know, the platform effectively has proposed a certain design. They've made a deliberate effort, of course, to acknowledge that at national level, it's largely social policies that address a lot of social issues already. So they want to be very explicit in acknowledging that fact. They also want to say that, you know, business inherently, often through creating employment and the like, creates benefits for society already. The reason for saying that is, of course, the platform wants to emphasize that a social taxonomy's purpose would be to identify investments that the private sector could make that might actually contribute toward social objectives or contribute toward achieving positive social outcomes. That said, you know, the social taxonomy, on the basis of the platform's report, would include a horizontal dimension, and that would sort of be maybe governance related, you could say. It would be, you know, it would relate rather to internal processes, policies and practices of companies and their direct social impact. There would also be a vertical dimension that would effectively identify various initiatives or projects, products or services that companies might provide as part of a initiative to foster greater social sustainability or cohesion. Perhaps, and not wanting to go into too much detail, most fundamentally, the social taxonomy wants to define what are social objectives. And these would be a corollary to environmental objectives in the green taxonomy. And thus far, the platform has identified a number of potential social objectives, which could include, say, investments that promote adequate living standards by improving access to basic human necessities like water, housing, and sanitation. Another social objective might be improving access to basic economic infrastructure, such as telecommunications. And then another social objective, sort of the third one elaborated so far by the platform, would be promoting positive social impacts, say by ensuring decent work, consumer protection, and inclusion. And just finally,
and so you go. I'm not an expert on these matters, but just to try and get make sense for the relative people that get rather new to those dimensions. Is it fair to say that your horizontal dimension is looking at some form of transparency from every company on some of their social practices, whereas the vertical dimension seems to follow the logic of the green taxonomy of identifying what makes a significant contribution to a social objective? Would you say this is a fair way of summarizing those two concepts?
Absolutely. I think that's actually a very sort of succinct way of putting it. And, let me share with you something that the platform mentions in their report. Effectively, they say that the horizontal dimension would focus more on avoiding significant harm by examining companies' practices, policies, and governance overall. Whereas the vertical dimension, as you say, follows the logic more of a green taxonomy, whereby it's trying to identify investments that could make a substantial contribution to a positive social outcome. So that's, a very kind of easy way of looking at it, or, still accurate though.
No, I think that's a lot of information for people to process, and that was obviously only the first report of the platform, because simultaneously we got another report from the platform on potentially extending the existing taxonomy in a different direction as well. And here I'm going to turn over to Federica. So Federica, we've heard about the social taxonomy, but simultaneously there's ideas about a significant harm taxonomy and no significant impact taxonomy. So I know you've looked very closely at that report. So can you maybe share with us your key takeaways from what the platform seems to be intending here?
Yes, Victor, as you actually said, the platform in this report analyzed the opportunity to extend the taxonomy to cover two new categories of activities: the activities that cause significant harm to environmental and climate objectives, and the activities that do not have impact, let's say neither negative nor positive, on the environmental and climate objectives. So basically here the platform wants to pursue two objectives. The first one is to overcome the misinterpretation of the taxonomy as binary. Let's say the activities that are not able to meet the technical screening criteria for a substantial contribution, let's say that are not green now, are considered often unsustainable. So the objective is to provide clarity of what is in the middle between substantial contribution and significant harm. The second objective is to make sure that the taxonomy is fit to provide support for the so-called transition finance. So to give more recognition to the corporates that make efforts to transition, so to improve their environmental and climate performance, even if they don't meet or don't actually meet the substantial contribution technical screening criteria. So if we look at the picture in the slides, and with regard to the significant harm taxonomy, basically the platform proposed to introduce 3 categories of activities. The activities substantially contributing to an environmental objective, which are the green activities, so whose performance is at or above the threshold set for the substantial contribution technical screening criteria. Then we have the activities doing significant harm to the environmental objectives, whose performance is below the threshold set by the technical screening criteria for do no significant harm. And finally, we have an area, which is the yellow area, with activities doing no significant harm to environmental sustainability, nor substantially contributing to the specific environmental objectives. So the performance neither fails the technical screening criteria for do no significant harm, nor reaches the technical screening criteria for substantial contribution. And that's what the platform calls intermediate performance level. So the platform in this report believes that this structure with green, yellow, and red allows reporting companies' efforts to move away, let's say, from the significant harm space, so the red space, to the intermediate performance space. And finally, we have proposal for a no significant harm taxonomy. The rationale here is to basically to provide information about the activities that are not yet in the taxonomy. So here the platform highlights pros and cons of this proposal. If we can look at the most important or the most highlighted pro of this proposal is to avoid the increased financing costs for the activities that are not yet in the taxonomy, so they are not covered by the taxonomy, to overcome the misinterpretation saying that if they are not in the taxonomy, they are not green. Among the cons, the fact that it is difficult to identify them. And what is important to underline here is that there is a difference, a substantial difference between the intermediate performance and the activities and the no significant impact activities. They are not the same thing. So from one part, we have the intermediate performance activities that are in the middle between substantial contribution and significant harm. And on the other parts, the activities that do not have impact, nor positive nor negative. That's basically the proposal of the platform.
And so it sounds as if if all that is enacted, we get a complete map of the economy in the color code, which sounds like a long-term endeavor.
This is the objective, but we have a consultation underway. So let's see what are the conclusions of the platform after this consultation.
Thank you very much, Federica, for this. Moving on to our next item of today is actually focusing on taxonomy alignment disclosures and potentially trying to assess also what the taxonomy reporting rules and taxonomy alignment that were unveiled alongside the strategy have as implications for the regulatory technical standards on the product disclosures on taxonomy alignment that we're expecting from the European supervisory agencies quite shortly, their final report to the Commission recommending those technical standards. And I think what's interesting here to dwell on this Article 8 Taxonomy Delegated Act is because the version that was published on the 6th of July contains some material differences compared to the version that was consulted on in June before. I think when we look at the non-financial side of the equation, so for non-financial companies, I think it was already the version I was consulted on already made very clear that probably, for the first year of reporting in 2023, for financial year 2023, financial year 2022, companies will be expected to disclose their eligibility. So in how far the economic activities they deploy are eligible under the different, NACE codes of the taxonomy. Separately to that, and the full analysis of their alignment of those activities with the technical screening criteria and the do no significant harm thresholds would be done and expected from those companies in 2023, giving thus far for investors and financial institutions a taxonomy alignment information from those investee companies in the quote unquote real economy. The major change that occurred is the taxonomy alignment disclosures for financial institutions, which were initially following a similar timeline, but now for all intent and purposes, if you look at the version that was published, full taxonomy alignment disclosures by financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, asset managers are not expected before 2024. With 2 intermediate years where companies will be expected to display their level of taxonomy eligibility, so the activities they finance, how eligible they are under the EU taxonomy, based on the information received from companies, and in 2024, the alignment. Based on, and there I think it's important to note that some pretty significant distinctions are being made between the types of exposure. So the final published delegated act makes clear that, like previous versions, all these sovereign bonds are to be excluded from the calculation, both in the numerator and the denominator of that taxonomy alignment calculation. Similarly, you see that exposures to SME companies, that is companies that are not subject to the requirements to publish a non-financial report under the non-financial reporting directive, were also excluded, as were exposures from to non-EU companies, so companies located outside the EU who do not fall in the scope of those obligations to publish that non-financial information. And from our perspective, we're seeing potentially several question marks and around how that will align with the policy objectives of the taxonomy alignment disclosures in the SFDR context. Because what you're seeing on the financial institution side of things is you are seeing a situation whereby if you take out government bonds from balance sheet, if you take out exposures to SMEs, if you take out exposures to non-EU companies, you're left with a relatively small asset base on which to disclose your taxonomy alignment, which may beg the question of how accurate or how reliable that picture it's given is providing for the full balance sheet of a large financial institution. But also, as we have known for a while, disclosures of eligibility versus alignment also potentially gives a different and maybe slightly misleading picture, in that sectors that may be highly eligible are not necessarily aligned from the taxonomy. And as we've seen on the previous slide, maybe either on a scale from significant contribution to no intermediate performance to actually potentially, a significant harm. And I think from Eurosif perspective, we're seeing that those disclosures that companies will have to provide between now and 2024 are expected to be a vital source of information for the product disclosures expected under the SFDR for taxonomy alignment, which will be due earlier than some of the disclosures by companies under the Article 8, which begs a question around the use of estimates, but also begs a question about the policy choices, as it seems to us that disclosing eligibility rather than alignment may cause some questions about how well-informed investors are about the greenness of their investment portfolios. So I think we are expecting that this, the publication of Article 8 may have some pretty profound implications for the regulatory technical standards on SFDR The ones obviously where we saw the draft being consulted on by the ESAs earlier this year, and where, as I said, we are expecting very soon the final report. So we will have to see how the different initiatives fit together and ensure adequate policy outcome for investors, bearing in mind that the absence of taxonomy alignment disclosures is likely also to have an impact on the implementation on the MiFID to sustainability advice amendments, where, just to recall for our audience, one of the categories of products identified, or at least one of the categories of questions an advisor would be expected to ask from his client, will be a percentage of taxonomy aligned assets that would be matched with the preference of the client and with the greenness of the portfolio. In the absence of that information, it becomes potentially quite hard to operationalize those categories in the advisory process. So in our opinion, this is a space that needs to be watched further in the future. But moving on to our other topics, and maybe now, returning back to you, Hugo, the Article 8 wasn't the only thing published alongside the strategy on the 6th of July. We also had the long-awaited EU Green Bond Standard. So what do we make of it? What is your take on what was published on that day?
Thanks, Victor. So indeed, no, I mean, the EU Green Bond Standard has at this point been sort of long anticipated. And I mean, I'm pleased to say from one point of view that what was proposed on the 6th of July does not deviate from, what we had anticipated the contents of the regulation or the proposal or the standard would be. And so for that reason, I'll be relatively, brief just in describing kind of the key elements of the EU Green Bond Standard. I suppose first and foremost, in terms of what is envisaged with the Green Bond Standard is the EU providing a global gold standard that would convey, the highest level of ambition on the part of issuers of green bonds. Of course, they acknowledge that the green bond market is quite dynamic and, has grown very rapidly. And within that context, the desire is that the EU Green Bond Standard would be a gold standard and would really just reflect, a very high level of ambition. Important to note is that it is an entirely voluntary standard, and it's available to both private issuers and sovereigns, irrespective of their geographic location, whether they are within the EU or outside the EU. What is sort of very important is that use of the standard will, of course, then trigger some quite significant regulatory obligations, in that, of course, the proceeds of an EU green bond would have to be allocated exclusively to financing projects or economic activities that qualify as environmentally sustainable in accordance with the EU taxonomy. All proceeds of the bond issuance have to be allocated fully to taxonomy aligned activities or projects, and the issuer will have to comply with some detailed reporting and transparency requirements in order to be able to attest to the fact that the proceeds of the issuance were actually used for their stated or advertised purpose. Quite importantly, whatever disclosures are made in relation to, EU green bond standards will be subject to external review and verification. And of course, when it comes to, supervisory oversight, the disclosures by issuers will be supervised by national competent authorities at national level, whereas ESMA will supervise the external reviewers. And that is kind of a broad outline of the EU Green Bond Standard at this juncture. Again, it doesn't deviate from what we understood the proposal would contain already, but I think I'll leave it there for the present.
Thank you, Hugo. And that's an opportunity for me to jump on one of the questions asked in the Q&A tool on what our views are on the interplay between the EU Green Bond Standard and the ICMA principles for green bonds. I think I think it's no surprise to many that I think, you know, we will have to see the market practice and see how much there is an uptake for EU green bonds in the next couple of years. Clearly, the threshold to finance activities by emitting EU green bond is high, because it needs to be with activities that are fully aligned with the taxonomy. So that may be quite, in some cases, quite challenging to meet those significant contribution and do no significant harm criteria, versus, you know, a bond maybe, you know, issued under the ICMA principles, which probably will have more flexibility in terms of what it is able to finance. And again, we know that with the linking the EU green bond to the taxonomy, you bring into the scope the challenges around data availability, the application of the taxonomy, as well as the existence of investable projects that need this type of financing at this stage. But that's that only market practice will tell over the next couple of years whether that's been a success or not. And that's an opportunity also to remind all our other participants that there's an opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A chat function. Moving on to probably our final topic of today. While we've seen a lot of activity on sustainable finance, that obviously doesn't happen in complete isolation at European level or in a vacuum, because I think we've seen also on the 14th of July, probably, I think from memory, one of the most ambitious legislative packages ever published by the European Commission in the area of climate and environmental legislation. So, Federica, we've heard a lot about Fit for 55. I think it's now in Brussels certainly kind of a new motto. Are you fit for 55 or not? But the question is, like, what is it? So maybe can you explain to our audience a bit what this gigantic package is?
Well, basically, it's a batch of 17 individual legislative or even some non-legislative initiatives, which are interlinked and complementary. And most of the proposals are revision of existing laws. And the aim is to tightening thresholds or upgrading the environmental ambition of these laws. So what's the objective of the Fit for 55 package? To introduce a regulatory framework that enables various economic activities to contribute to achieving the European 2030 climate target, which is everybody knows the 55% emission reduction as compared to 1990 by 2030. So this Fit for 55 package has been described as the moment of truth for the European Union because actually it operationalized the commitment which is enshrined in the climate law. So this package has different types of measures. We have measures to increase the price of carbon, which are, for example, the revision of the EU emission trading scheme, the so-called CBAM, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and we also have an updated energy taxation directive. Then we have proposals with new targets and standards, like, for example, the updated renewable energy directive, the updated energy efficiency directive, and an updated effort sharing regulation, which goes to the emission reduction target for each member states. Then we have measures to expand the capacity of renewable energy infrastructure, for example, asking member states to expand the existing framework and infrastructure for sustainable fuels, for example. And finally, but not less important, mitigating supports activities, like, for example, a social climate fund, which enable member states to provide support to people for all the initiatives that touch everyday life, like, for example, road transport or buildings. So now the question, how about the politics? Of course, we are talking about proposals. Each one should be discussed separately by the European co-legislator, which are the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament. Of course, this This procedure will take several months, depending on the complexity and the level of controversy of each proposal. We know that some of them are already discussed, for example, the revision of the emission trading scheme and the CBAM, which is the tax on imports for some goods. So which are the implications, or which will be the implication for investors? Well, we will be able to answer this question when all the proposals are approved, and we will see how they will change from the initial version. But now for the situation in which we are now, we can already say that the overall initiative send strong signals to the market, meaning that it says clearly where policy and regulatory framework is going in the next 10 and then 30 years, because we know that our horizon is 2050. And in particular, the measures that are aimed at increasing the price of carbon, for example, the EU trading scheme and the CBAM and the energy taxation rules, can make it easier to reconcile the climate ambition and portfolio constraint for investors. For example, looking at the net zero strategies, we know how the carbon price is a problem when setting and deciding a net zero strategy. Finally, we can already say that environmental and climate regulation will become increasingly material for investors. So investors should look at the climate and environmental regulation for their activities, especially in terms of risk mitigation, but not only. And to conclude, and in a kind of circular way as we started, we can sure say that all the discussions that will arise around this package will affect also all the discussions around the taxonomy. So we are not speaking about different sectors, different areas, so finance and real economy, but they are of course strictly interlinked. If we remind that the taxonomy regulation touches the economic activities.
Thanks for that, Federica. It's a nice close of the circle for today. Picking up, finalizing today's session and picking up on a few of the questions raised in the Q&A before we end today's session. And I remind people there's still an opportunity of a few minutes to ask questions, but maybe turning on to the first question very quickly, passing that on to you, Hugo. One of the attendees is asking, what are the next steps we have now and we know of around the social taxonomy? Once the consultation closed, what are the next steps on the social?
Sure, thanks, Victor. And that's relatively straightforward. Although saying that there might be some confusion between the platform and the Commission as to who is supposed to deliver what. But effectively, as you're aware, the social taxonomy will be open for feedback, or rather, the interim report on the social taxonomy will be, open for public feedback until the 27th of August. Thereafter, the platform is going to continue work on finalizing its report and issue a final report at the latest by the end of 2021. That is what they specify in the interim report. If you look at the strategy published by the Commission, they of course say the Commission will, effectively adopt a position on whether to proceed with a social taxonomy, or at least what provisions of a social taxonomy might be needed to operationalize it by the end of 2021. And they specify that they're expecting the platform to deliver their final report in October 2021. So if we take the Commission's timing, you can expect the consultation to close 27th of August, final report October 2021, and then a Commission further development by the end of the year. But again, there's a few sort of inconsistencies in the timeframes that the platform and the Commission have presented. So, but I hope that clarifies things.
Nothing. I think that's a very, very comprehensive answer in terms of the next concrete milestones in that project. And then turning on to one of our last questions, obviously around our favorite topic of SFDR and the lingering uncertainty there might exist around that framework, and actually multiple questions. So one of our attendees is asking for Article 8 products, what could be the contemplated minimum sustainability criteria, as probably referenced into the European Commission strategy. I think at this stage, this is a bit of a question mark and a bit of a speculation of what it might look like. But what is clear is that that stems from, I think, an increasing awareness by policymakers as well as many regulators around Europe that the way market participants have interpreted the classification of products on SFDR is very heterogeneous. And you see a huge diversity in the types of investment strategies covered, and that it is, and therefore, at least it's our understanding that one of the stated policy objectives of this SFDR, which was comparability across products, is coming under some strain. So I think this is something we'll have to watch carefully in the future, where the problem lies, where what the solution to that alleged problem might be. On the second question is, how do we interpret the fact that similar criteria are not expected for Article 9 products? I think the idea is that at least behind Article 9 products, there is one joint definition underpinning that, which is definition of sustainable investment as enshrined in SFDR, which at least makes a difference in the sense there's one definition applied. Again, without speculating too much at this stage, but I think it's clear that any market practitioner will have seen that definition is also interpreted quite differently and widely by different financial market participants, and therefore, we would agree with the question that if you look at Article 8, why also not look at Article 9 to check that there is some at least some coherence in that in the way the definition has been interpreted. And the final question is, beyond obviously the Q&As on SFDR that were published yesterday, can we expect any further guidance on Article 8-9 at this stage? At this stage, our understanding is that we will not see any additional clarifications on Article 8 and 9 beyond concrete actions which may emanate from the action taken into the reflected in the strategy that was published on the 6th of July. So we are not aware at this stage of any further clarifications being provided, but we are aware that there are still many interpretative questions out there by the industry in terms of understanding the classification of products, and then particularly how consistently products of a certain type may be classified in different categories. So this is clearly an area where we would anticipate a lot more work in the next couple of years in trying to provide answers to exactly those questions. I think we have actually answered all the questions we had, and I see there's no more questions. So I wanted to thank you everyone again for tuning in this update. We hope you found it useful. Do not hesitate to reach out to the Eurosif team if you've got additional questions or clarifications we can provide. Also, as a note, the Eurosif team will be also benefiting from the August lull, and therefore we will not be running a webinar in August on developments in EU sustainable finance. As most of you know, Brussels shuts down in August, but we will look forward to reconvening in September for those updates, and we will shortly be providing you with the update on the date and the possibility to register for that. Trust me to wish you a very good end of the day, good end of the week, and for those of you who might take some break, enjoy that, and I'm sure we will come back to September, which is very busy on the sustainable finance front. Wish you a good rest of the day. Goodbye.